Welcome to Ghost Trails of America. Today, we're diving into a dark journey with 15 terrifying real-life stories. Tales that might send chills down your spine and make you question whether you should continue listening in the dark. From mysterious disappearances to encounters with the fearsome creature known as Dogman. Each story comes from those who lived through these eerie experiences. Make sure you've turned off the lights, put on your headphones, and prepared yourself, because what you're about to hear is not for the faint-hearted. Let's begin. Story number 1. Dogman appears on the highway. If anyone had asked me about the Dogman, the mythical creature rumored to roam the dark forests of Michigan, I'd have said it was just a joke. A scary story to spook people. But ever since Halloween night last year, I don't dare say that anymore. I saw it, or at least I think I did. And that image, that look, still haunts me. Every time I remember, I refuse to take that highway at night. It all happened on Halloween night last year after I'd just completed my final passenger drop-off. I'm a truck driver and have driven all over Michigan for the past 2 decades. Familiar with every turn, every stretch of road, every sign, that night, the air was colder than usual, and the wind was howling in a way that brought a strange chill I'd never felt before. The highway was eerily empty, there wasn't a single car in sight. Just me and the dimmed glow from my dashboard lights. It was nearly midnight when I reached the stretch of highway that cuts through a dense forest. The streetlights in this area had been out for years, leaving everything pitch dark. My headlights only illuminated a few meters ahead, and I felt my eyes starting to sting from fatigue. Suddenly, far ahead, I saw something standing in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some animal that had wandered onto the highway. It's not uncommon in Michigan, especially in deep forested areas like this. But as I got closer, I began to realize this was no ordinary animal. Under the beam of my headlights, I saw it more clearly. It was a tall creature standing on 2 legs. Its body covered in thick, dark fur. Its eyes, they glowed red, staring straight at me with a chilling gaze that seemed to pierce through the truck. Reaching right into my soul, I felt my heart racing. And every instinct warned me that this was no ordinary creature. It looked like a dog, but not entirely. Its lower body resembled a person's legs, but much larger, powerful, and terrifying. I couldn't take my eyes off it. It stood there, motionless, as if observing me, contemplating something. I felt as though time had frozen, leaving just the 2 of us, locked in that horrifying moment. I'd seen a lot in my years on the road, but nothing like this. For a moment, I thought about turning the truck around and driving away. But as soon as I blinked, it vanished. It disappeared in a split second. Without a trace, without a sound, as if it had never been there at all. I sat there, frozen, trying to breathe deeply to steady myself. But nothing worked. I glanced out the window and through the rearview mirror but saw nothing. Only the thick darkness of the forest. My heart was pounding, and I realized I'd been gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers hurt. I pressed the accelerator and sped away, not daring to look back. My whole body was trembling, every nerve on high alert. The only thought in my mind was, I need to get out of here, away from this stretch of road. Finally, when I saw the lights of a rest stop, I pulled over, parked, and sat quietly in the driver's seat. I tried to calm myself, convincing myself I was just overtired and hallucinating. But deep down, I knew what I had seen was real. Those red eyes, that haunting look, that wasn't something my imagination could have created. I shared this story with a few fellow drivers, but most just laughed, saying I must have imagined it. But one of them, an older driver, looked at me for a long time before finally speaking. "You saw it, didn't you? The Dogman." I was taken aback. "Dogman? What do you mean?" The driver went on to explain that there's a legend in Michigan about a creature known as the Dogman, a half-dog, half-human entity that appears on deserted roads at night, especially in the forest. For hundreds of years, it's believed that the Dogman has roamed here, only emerging on dark, lonely nights, witnessed only by those lost along shadowy highways. I don't know what led me to that encounter on Halloween night. But since then, every time I pass that stretch of highway, I feel as if those eyes are still watching me from a dark corner of the forest. And sometimes, in my dreams, I see it again. The creature with glowing red eyes standing in the middle of the road, staring right at me as if waiting for something. I can't explain what I saw, nor do I know if the Dogman truly exists. But one thing is for certain, I will never forget that look. That cold, enigmatic gaze that only a creature from the darkness could possess. And if one day you find yourself driving alone down a lonely Michigan highway, beware, you never know who, or what, might be waiting for you in the shadows. Story number 2. The Manistee Forest. I've never been one to believe in the supernatural or ghostly tales. In fact, I used to laugh at people who believed in old legends. But a Halloween camping trip last year changed everything. That night, deep in the Manistee Forest, I saw something I still find hard to believe, the Dogman. There were 4 of us, me, my best friend Mike, and 2 other friends, Sarah and Tom. We all loved adventure and exploring. So that Halloween, we decided to do something different from the usual costume parties and city celebrations. We chose to camp in the Manistee Forest, known for eerie legends about a half-man, half-dog creature. Mike, the mastermind behind this idea, laughed as he noticed our slight unease. "It's just a bit of fun. Let's test our courage," Mike said excitedly, slapping me on the shoulder. We arrived at the forest in the late afternoon, just as the sun began setting behind the tall trees. The dim light filtering through the forest cast strange, elongated shadows on the ground. The silence was almost unsettling. The only sounds were the crunch of dry leaves beneath our feet and the wind brushing through the trees. Camping in a spot far removed from any signs of human life filled us with both excitement and unease. After setting up camp, we sat around the fire, sharing scary stories. Naturally, the tale of the Dogman came up quickly. Mike started recounting sightings of the creature in Michigan's dark forests, areas people rarely ventured into at night. The Dogman, you know, has been sighted in Manistee Forest many times. Some say it's a giant creature, wolf-like but standing on 2 legs, with red eyes and thick black fur. They say if you encounter it, you have 2 options. Either run as fast as you can or never leave the forest. Mike said with dramatic emphasis. We laughed nervously, but deep down, I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't believe the story. But in the dark depths of Manistee, unease crept in. The flickering flames only seemed to deepen the darkness around us, making everything feel more mysterious and unsettling. When night fully descended, we crawled into our tents. Despite the exhaustion, I couldn't sleep. Maybe it was the silence, or perhaps those stories had seeped into my mind. But every time I closed my eyes, I felt as if someone or something was watching from the depths of the shadows. Around midnight, I heard a strange sound outside the tent, crunching leaves. Slow and steady footsteps. I opened my eyes, feeling my heart race. I looked at Mike and Tom, both lying still, their faces tense. They'd heard it too. Sarah whispered in a shaky voice. What's walking out there?" I didn't know, but something urged me to check. Grabbing a small flashlight, I gently unzipped the tent to peek outside. The light swept over the trees, revealing nothing but dim shadows. But just as I was about to close the zipper, I caught sight of a tall figure standing among the trees. My heart stopped. The figure was towering, taller than any human, standing on 2 legs like a man. But its face was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was the face of a massive wolf, covered in thick black fur, with glowing red eyes staring directly at me. None of us could speak, but we all felt an overwhelming sense of terror. The creature stood there motionless for a few seconds before it tilted its head slightly, as if observing us more closely. Then, it stepped back into the shadows, disappearing among the trees, leaving only the quiet darkness as it had been. We remained frozen, unable to move or speak. I felt paralyzed, hoping this was all just a terrible nightmare. At dawn, we packed up silently. No one dared mention the events of the night before. But the look in each of our eyes said it all. We'd all seen it. The Dogman. The creature that had haunted Michigan's forests for years. As we left the forest, I glanced back one last time, sensing something watching us from the dark depths of Manistee. Since that night, we've never dared step foot in those dark woods again. Some things belong to a world we're better off not knowing. And I'm certain the Dogman is one of them. If you ever decide to camp in Manistee, beware of the shadows at night. And whatever you do, don't turn around if you hear footsteps. Story number 3. The Dogman at the Window. Last Halloween, my family experienced something that none of us could have imagined, and none of us can forget. It was a night when everything in our home suddenly felt strange. chilling, and incredibly eerie. What I'm about to share may sound like an urban legend, but it's true. A truth that's made us reconsider staying in the place we once called home. That Halloween night, we prepared like any other normal family. Kids from the neighborhood came around for candy, while my wife and I stood by the door, handing out treats to children in their adorable costumes. The air was cold, and the heavy fog added to the eerie atmosphere. Somehow, this Halloween felt different from every other year. I couldn't explain why, but there was something off. As the clock approached midnight, I started cleaning up, putting away the jack-o'-lanterns and Halloween decorations from the front yard. The kids in the neighborhood had long since gone home, and the street was now deserted, shrouded in darkness and a chilling silence. I remember clearly checking every door and window, making sure everything was locked before heading to bed. But as I climbed into bed, an unusual noise echoed from the living room window downstairs. It was a faint tap. Tap, clear and deliberate, as though someone was lightly knocking on the glass. At first, I thought it could be a tree branch brushing against the window. But then the sound came again, louder and more persistent. A chill ran down my spine as I turned to my wife, Julia, whose face was as pale as mine. Both of us got up and walked to the living room to check. When I flipped on the light, we saw a large shadow standing outside the window, as if it was waiting for us to notice its presence. I can hardly describe the terror I felt in that moment. Outside the window, in the dark night, stood a tall figure. It was upright, on two legs, with a face resembling a wolf's, but more grotesque and horrifying. Its fur was thick, black, and matted, but what terrified us the most were its eyes, glowing red like embers, staring straight at us through the glass. Unblinking, unmoving. My heart pounded as I gripped Julia's hand tightly, trying to keep calm. The creature didn't move, it simply stood there. But its gaze felt like it was piercing through the glass, straight into our souls. I didn't dare move, didn't dare look away from those fiery red eyes. Then, it knocked on the glass again. A slow, steady, and chilling rhythm. The tapping echoed through the room, confirming that this was no figment of our imagination. I had heard of the Dogman before, a creature said to be part man, part dog, that roams the dark forests and appears on Halloween nights. But I never imagined that I would encounter it, right outside my own home. Julia whispered, her voice so shaky I had to lean in to hear her. Does it see us? I didn't know how to answer. It certainly looked like it was staring straight at us, but it showed no intention of breaking in. The creature simply stood there, and the knocking continued, each knock like a knife twisting deeper, testing our patience and our courage. Taking a deep breath, I tried to approach the window, hoping it would go away if it saw we weren't afraid. But as soon as I took a step forward, the creature leaned closer, its face pressing against the glass, allowing me to see every unsettling detail of its monstrous visage, those blazing red eyes, its sharp, menacing teeth gleaming in the dim street light. I froze, paralyzed by the sight. We didn't know how long it stood there. But then, without warning, the creature stepped back, gave us one last stare, and turned, slowly disappearing into the darkness without a trace. I exhaled in relief, but the fear remained, lingering in the air like a shadow. Julia and I didn't sleep a wink that night. We sat in the living room, waiting for the sound to return. But the rest of the night passed in silence. The next morning, as daylight finally broke, I went outside to check, hoping that what we had seen was just a nightmare. But when I looked at the window, I saw faint scratches, like claw marks etched into the glass. The marks weren't deep, but they were enough to confirm that what we experienced that night was very real. Since that night, every Halloween, we brace ourselves, dreading that the knocking might return. We no longer feel safe in our own home, as though something from the darkness has taken notice of us. And every time I recall those glowing red eyes, that piercing stare, I wonder, did the Dogman come just to scare us? Or does it have a more sinister reason for returning? Story number 4. Quote, the Dogman on the Pinckney Trail. I'd heard plenty of eerie stories about strange creatures lurking in Michigan's forests, but I'd never truly believed any of them. Dogman, the legendary beast whispered about for centuries, was just that to me, a legend, a campfire tale to spook others in the dark. But last Halloween, my perspective changed. That night, we, myself, Mark, my girlfriend Emily, and our friends Ryan and Julie, decided to take a nighttime hike through Pinckney Forest. The idea came up during a get-together when we were looking for something bold, with a bit of an eerie thrill. For Halloween, Mark was the mastermind, joking, "Let's go find the Dogman. Who's up for it?" We all laughed, no one truly believing it could happen. But the excitement was infectious. The Pinckney Trail isn't long, but it weaves through dense trees, curves around a small lake, and eventually winds deep into a lesser-traveled part of the forest. The night was clear but chilly, with fog swirling around the forest, creating a ghostly veil. We switched on our flashlights, chatting and laughing to push away the quiet tension that lingered in the midnight woods. We'd been walking for quite a while, and just as we were getting accustomed to the sound of crickets and leaves rustling, we stopped to rest in a small clearing off the trail. Emily sat on a rock, while Ryan and Julie kept joking about ghost stories. Though we seemed relaxed, I could feel a vague, unsettling presence, as though something was quietly watching us from afar. And then, Mark stopped mid-sentence, his eyes fixed on something in the dark a few meters away. Do you see that?" he whispered, his voice low and tense. The group fell silent, following his gaze. At first, I saw nothing but thick fog and blackened tree trunks. But as I focused, my flashlight trembled, and there it was, a figure. Standing still, looming in the shadows, was a creature twice the size of any of us. Staring right back, it was completely motionless, its eyes emitting a faint red glow, piercing through the fog and freezing me in place. The creature's body was covered in thick, black fur, with long limbs that looked ready to reach out, and a face like a wolf's, with sharp teeth glinting under the flashlight's dim beam. No one said a word. All sounds around us seemed to vanish, replaced only by our shallow, shaking breaths and the cold gaze of the creature. I couldn't comprehend why I couldn't move, just standing there, locked in its gaze, fear pulsing through me. Ryan finally broke the silence, stepping back and looking around frantically. "We need to get out of here," he yelled, shattering the eerie quiet. The creature stayed still for a moment, but then, in a heartbeat, it bolted. We all flinched as it dashed off, vanishing into the depths of the forest as quickly as it appeared. The heavy sound of its footsteps echoed briefly before fading, leaving us with an oppressive silence, as though nothing had ever been there. We just stood there, panting, eyes wide with terror. Nobody needed to say it. We all knew we had seen the real thing, Dogman. The half-man, half-wolf creature we once thought existed only in tales. Without another thought, we immediately retraced our steps. My legs felt like they could give out any second, but I forced myself to keep moving, too scared to look back. The only image that repeated in my mind was the creature's glowing red eyes, unblinking, as it silently watched us, almost as if it were waiting for something. When we finally reached the edge of the forest, we couldn't believe we had truly escaped. We scrambled into the car and drove away from Pinckney, not daring to look back. That night, sleep was out of the question. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those red eyes burning in the dark, their glow not from the flashlight but from within, like a flame in the night. Since that night, none of us has ever returned to Pinckney. We avoid talking about what happened, but we all know that we're haunted by the image of that creature, Dogman, lurking in the darkness. Waiting. Story number 5. The Howl on Halloween Night. I don't even know where to begin with this story because, even now, I still can't believe what I heard. But it's true that, on Halloween night last year, I experienced something so chilling that, to this day, my heart races and a cold shiver runs down my spine every time I think about it. That year, I was living alone in a small log cabin on the edge of a forest in Michigan. I'd recently moved there, looking for a peaceful life away from the noise of the city. Fall in Michigan is stunning, with vibrant reds and golds painting the trees. Halloween came with an unexpected chill, with strong winds whipping through the trees, rustling the dry leaves scattered on the ground. The sun set faster than usual, and the darkness felt heavier as I sat alone in my cabin. That night, I didn't have any special plans. I just wanted to sit by the fire, sip a warm drink, and read my favorite book. Halloween didn't mean much to me, and I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. To me, it was just another day of the year, nothing worth worrying about. In fact, I was grateful I didn't have to deal with trick-or-treaters. But around 11 p.m., as the warmth from the fire lulled me into drowsiness, A strange sound echoed from somewhere far off. At first, I thought it was just the wind whistling through the trees. But this howl was different, long, eerie, and haunting, like some creature calling out from the depths of the earth. The howl reverberated through the night, piercing the forest stillness, and made every nerve in my body go taut. I sat up straight, unable to look away from the window. Outside, there was nothing but darkness and the occasional sway of branches in the wind. But the sound didn't stop, it carried on. Steady, repeated, as if something lost in the woods was calling out in endless despair. I stood up and went to the window, trying to listen more closely. This was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It wasn't a wolf's howl, nor the sound of wind. It was a deep, prolonged, bone-chilling howl. My heart pounded as if some primal fear deep within me had surfaced, warning me that what I was hearing was dangerous. The howl continued. A sense of terror settled over me. But I tried to tell myself it was just an animal. Maybe some species I wasn't familiar with. But everything in me insisted otherwise. I'd heard of Dogman, the legendary half-man, half-dog creature of Michigan folklore, but I'd never truly believed in those stories. Until tonight. Around midnight, the howl suddenly ceased. The entire forest fell into absolute silence, as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I'd heard was real. That howl didn't belong to this world. I had heard Dogman, or at the very least, something just as terrifying. When I returned to the living room to sit by the fire and calm myself, I realized I was still trembling. That Halloween night was unlike any Halloween I had ever experienced. I had heard the howl of Dogman, and now, I can't help but wonder if that creature still roams nearby, waiting for Halloween night to once again fill the deep woods with its haunting cry. So, if you ever find yourself in Michigan and hear a howl on Halloween night, be careful. Dogman might just be closer than you think. Story number 6. The Bray Road Police Report. I'm a police officer in Wisconsin, working in a small, peaceful, and somewhat isolated area near Bray Road, a road infamous for legends about strange creatures, with the most famous being Dogman. I used to think these tales were absurd, merely products of imagination and word of mouth. But one Halloween night a few years ago, I had an experience that I still find hard to forget. Halloween night is typically my shift. This area doesn't see much action on Halloween, but I still make my rounds on the outskirts of town to make sure there's no over-the-top mischief from the local kids. Especially near Bray Road, notorious for ghost stories. That night, the atmosphere was heavier and colder than usual, with thick fog covering the entire road, drastically reducing visibility. Around midnight, while driving along Bray Road, I received an urgent call from dispatch. A resident had phoned in, their voice shaky and filled with fear, saying they'd just seen something strange. They insisted they'd seen Dogman, a massive, half-human, half-dog creature with glowing red eyes, standing in the middle of the road and staring at them before it darted off into the darkness. This wasn't the first report of its kind I'd heard, but usually, they came from people who were drunk or kids seeking attention. Honestly, I almost dismissed the report, thinking it was just another Halloween prank. But something about the caller's voice made me reconsider. There was genuine fear in their tone, a terror that felt too real to be made up. I decided to drive over to the location they'd reported, though I was skeptical. When I arrived, everything was enveloped in darkness and a strange, eerie silence. The night seemed to swallow the road, with only my headlights illuminating a small patch in front of me. I carefully shone my flashlight into the woods on either side of the road, not expecting to see anything out of the ordinary. But then, as I turned off the car engine to listen more closely, an unusual sound came from within the trees. It wasn't the noise of an animal or the wind rustling through branches. It was a deep, heavy breathing mixed with a low growl, a sound that made every hair on my body stand on end. My heart started to race, and I gripped my flashlight tightly with one hand, my other hand resting on my gun, ready for anything. My police instincts warned me to be cautious, but another part of me was intrigued, wondering if the creature could really exist. My flashlight scanned through the thick bushes, and just as I was about to give up, thinking it was all my imagination, the beam landed on a pair of glowing eyes. They were blood red, staring directly at me from a distance. I instinctively took a step back, feeling the tension in the air intensify. The creature was standing amidst the bushes, taller than any dog I'd ever seen. and even taller than most grown men. It was covered in dense, black fur, with a form that was half human, half canine, like an enormous wolf standing upright on two legs. My heart raced as I realized that this wasn't an ordinary animal, and there was no logical explanation for its presence. Its gaze was intense, dark, and chilling, as if it wanted to pierce through the glass between us, as if it knew I was there, mocking my fear. Every instinct told me to get out of there immediately. I turned back to my car, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. On my way back, the memory of that heavy breathing and those glowing red eyes haunted me, as though it was still out there in the darkness, watching my every move. Back at the station, I reported what I'd seen, but all I received were skeptical glances and laughter from my colleagues. No one believed me, and honestly, I didn't expect them to. But from that night on, I knew that there were things in the woods around Bray Road that couldn't be explained. That Halloween, Bray Road wasn't just a narrow lane in Wisconsin. It was the place where I truly saw something that I'd once believed only existed in legends. Believe it or not, I am certain that Dogman is real, and he's out there somewhere, hiding in the shadows, ready to reappear on Halloween night to strike fear into anyone brave, or unlucky, enough to encounter him. Story number 7. Quote, The Encounter at the Abandoned Church. I've never been one to believe in ghost stories or the strange creatures people talk about. But Halloween night last year changed everything. My friends and I decided to do something that now, I think, was the stupidest decision we ever made. Exploring an abandoned church in the dead of night. What we saw there has haunted me ever since. That night, I was with my 3 closest friends, Jason, Lily, and Mike. We had just left a Halloween party in town, and none of us wanted the night to end just yet. I remember it clearly. Jason was the one who suggested it. Hey, have you guys ever heard about the old church on the outskirts of town? Jason asked, a mischievous gleam in his eye. They say strange things happen there. Why don't we go check it out? Lily shot him a skeptical look, but she couldn't resist the thrill of Halloween night. Mike, as usual, was all for it. As for me, I was hesitant but also drawn to the idea of exploring an abandoned place. So, we agreed. We piled into the car and drove down the narrow, dark road leading to the outskirts. The old church, built in the late 19th century, sat in isolation, surrounded by overgrown fields and dense trees. The place had been abandoned for decades, and rumors had long circulated about strange occurrences there. Its windows were shattered, its walls were covered in moss, and weeds sprouted all around, giving it an eerie, neglected appearance. When we arrived, the moon cast a dim glow over the peeling walls, casting long shadows that only added to the unsettling vibe. The air was cold, and the silence was so intense you could hear the rustling of leaves as the wind swept through. A vague sense of dread settled in me, but I kept telling myself it was just irrational fear. We turned on our flashlights and entered the church. The faint light illuminated rows of dusty wooden pews and cracked walls, creating a scene that was both haunting and mysterious. The broken windows let in slivers of moonlight, but they weren't enough to chase away the darkness. Our footsteps echoed through the vast space, making it feel as though we were intruding on a place that didn't welcome the living. We walked slowly, shining our flashlights into every shadowed corner. While Jason and Mike were laughing and joking, Lily and I grew increasingly uneasy. I had the distinct feeling that someone, or something, was watching us from the darkness. I didn't say anything, but I knew Lily felt it too. I caught her glancing nervously around, her eyes wide with worry. As we neared the back of the church, we suddenly caught a whiff of a foul, unearthly stench. It was unlike anything I'd smelled before, a mixture of damp earth, decay, and something wild and feral. Then, without warning, Lily froze, her eyes fixed on a dark corner of the room. I turned to look where she was pointing, and my heart nearly stopped. Standing in the shadows, just at the edge of our flashlight beams, was a massive creature with the shape of a giant dog. But it wasn't on 4 legs. It stood upright on 2 legs, towering and muscular, with thick black fur covering its body. Its eyes glowed a vivid red, like 2 flames in the dark. Its gaze was icy and penetrating, as if it could see right through us. I felt paralyzed, unable to move. The creature simply stood there, staring at us without moving. I could hear its heavy, labored breathing, and a low growl rumbled from its chest. "We need to get out of here," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible as it shook with fear. But just as we started to turn, the creature let out a roar, a deep, bone-chilling sound that seemed to shake the entire church. It took a step forward, and our flashlight beams caught its face, a wolf-like visage with razor-sharp teeth and eyes filled with a burning rage. We didn't wait another second. We all bolted, not daring to look back. The roar continued behind us, as though it was pursuing us. I don't remember how fast I ran, only that when I finally reached the door, I almost collapsed from fear. We scrambled into the car, driving away as fast as we could, leaving the haunted church and that terrifying creature behind. None of us spoke on the drive back, each lost in our own terror. That night, I lay awake, haunted by the image of those red eyes and the echo of its monstrous growl. Since that Halloween, we haven't dared go back to that church. I can't forget the look that creature gave us, a look from something that didn't belong to our world. Something that should never have been disturbed. Story number 8. The Dogman appears by the cornfield. If someone had asked me about the Dogman a year ago, I probably would have laughed it off, thinking they'd been tricked by ghost stories meant for children. But after Halloween last year, I can't laugh anymore. That night, in the bone-chilling cold of rural Wisconsin and in the thick darkness, I witnessed something I still can't explain. My cornfield sits in a small rural town in northern Wisconsin, where the air always smells of earth and plants, and the night sky is pitch black. I've lived here all my life, knowing every inch of my land and the surrounding fields. Every year on Halloween, I usually stay inside, listening to the wind howl through the corn rows, hearing the strange rustling sounds that echo throughout the countryside. Last Halloween night wasn't any different. The temperature dropped, and thick fog covered everything, giving the place an eerie feeling. I had just settled down to sleep when I heard a strange sound. It was the noise of something heavy pushing through the corn, as if something big was moving through the field. At first, I thought it was probably a deer or maybe a buck, since they sometimes wander through the fields at night in search of food. But the sound was different from anything I'd ever heard. It was heavy and slow, like something huge was forcing its way through the rows of corn. Curious, I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, feeling both excited and strangely uneasy. Standing at the edge of the field, I shone my flashlight out into the distance, the dim beam cutting through the towering corn stalks and the dense darkness. But I saw nothing, just pitch blackness and the sound of the wind whispering through the corn. Just as I was about to turn back, a shape suddenly appeared in the distance within the field, freezing me in place. It was a tall, shaggy figure standing upright, like a human. Even from afar, I could see its eyes, bright, glowing red, shining strangely through the darkness. My heart raced, and for a moment, I thought I must be imagining things. But the creature stayed still, staring right at me from the shadows. I couldn't look away, my body frozen in place. In the dim glow of the flashlight and the thick fog, I could see every detail of its body. It had the head of a wolf, with sharp fangs and a face covered in fur. Yet, its body resembled that of a human, tall, powerful, and muscular. A single word echoed in my mind: Dogman. This was the mythical creature people had spoken about for years. A creature half human, half dog, said to roam the forests and fields of Wisconsin. But I had never believed in such things. Not until now. The creature simply stood there, silently watching me without moving or making a sound. I couldn't tell what it was thinking or what it planned to do next. Every second that passed, the fear in me grew, like the darkness around me was closing in. Then, suddenly, it turned and walked away, disappearing into the rows of corn as mysteriously as it had appeared. I tried to follow with my flashlight, but its dim light couldn't penetrate far enough to track its path. It moved quickly and silently, as though it weren't a real creature but a phantom lost in the night fog. I stood there, paralyzed, staring into the rows of corn where it had vanished. Only the sound of the wind and the surrounding darkness remained. Yet I felt as though those glowing red eyes were still watching me from somewhere deep within the field. I don't know how long I stayed there, but when I finally returned to the house, the sense of dread hadn't faded. I couldn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those red eyes shining out from the darkness. The next day, I tried convincing myself it was just a nightmare, an illusion caused by fatigue and Halloween tales. but deep down, I knew what I had seen was real. That creature, the Dogman, existed, and it was roaming somewhere in those cornfields, hidden within the shadows and the thick fog. Since that night, as darkness falls, I lock my doors tightly and stay far from the field. And if you ever find yourself near the cornfields of Wisconsin on Halloween night, look closely. You never know who, or what, might be lurking in the darkness, waiting to meet your gaze with those glowing red eyes. Story number 9. Dogman at the cemetery. I never thought I'd believe in the supernatural. But last Halloween night made me reconsider. It was a night when I, along with my 3 close friends, Ryan, Emily, and Jake, decided to challenge ourselves by visiting the town cemetery. A place infamous for eerie tales. None of us had ever taken these stories seriously. But Halloween is a special night, and going to the cemetery at midnight seemed like the perfect way to add some thrill to the evening. The cemetery lies on the edge of town, surrounded by dark, dense trees. The atmosphere was strangely quiet and chilling, as though even the air was filled with death and silent mysteries. That night, a heavy fog spread across the area, cloaking the old tombstones in an ominous and haunting veil, amplifying the fearsome ambiance. We started at the main gate, where a cold stone angel statue stood watch. The weak beam from our flashlights swept over rows of graves, illuminating aged headstones with faded engravings. Our footsteps echoed in the silent air, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching from the shadows. No one in the group spoke. We walked in silence, all tense. We didn't want to admit it, but it was clear everyone felt uneasy. Emily clutched my arm tightly, her eyes darting around as though she was searching for something. Even Jake, who usually acted fearless, was quieter than usual. Then, as we approached the back of the cemetery, I suddenly heard a noise. It was a faint rustling, just enough to break the stillness. I stopped and signaled for everyone to stay quiet and listen. We all stood frozen, barely breathing as we tried to pick up the sound. And then, in the darkness ahead of us, a strange figure slowly came into view. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, maybe a bush or a large tombstone. But when Ryan's flashlight caught it, I realized it was no ordinary object. It was a large creature, standing upright like a human but with the shape of an enormous wolf. Its body was covered in thick, black fur, its legs powerful, and its hands had sharp claws. And its eyes, they glowed red, staring at us from only a few yards away. We all froze, speechless. I could feel my heart pounding painfully hard, and my breath became shallow. The creature stood still, merely watching us, without a sound or a single movement. Its gaze was cold and piercing, as if it was assessing each of us, looking for the weakest. I don't know how long we stood there, but it felt like time had stopped. The creature just stared at us. And then, as if it had decided something, it turned and vanished into the darkness, moving so quickly and silently that none of us had time to react. After a moment, Ryan whispered, his voice trembling, "Did we just see Dogman?" No one answered. We all looked at each other, eyes filled with confusion and fear. Those red eyes, that massive figure, it was like we'd just lived through a nightmare. Without a word, we all turned and ran as fast as we could toward the cemetery gate. I felt as if something was chasing us from behind but didn't dare look back. My only thought was, get out of here. When we finally reached the gate, we were panting and wide-eyed, too scared to speak about what we had just witnessed. None of us wanted to mention Dogman, fearing that merely saying the name would bring the creature back from the shadows to find us. That night, back at home, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those red eyes staring at me from the darkness. Strange noises in the night kept startling me, and I kept imagining Dogman lurking around my house, waiting for the right moment to reappear. Since that night, I've never returned to the cemetery after dark. What I saw that Halloween night wasn't just a mysterious creature. It was a terror I never want to confront again. Story number 10. The Abandoned House in Michigan. If anyone had asked me about ghost stories or mysterious creatures before, I'd laugh and dismiss them as jokes. But last Halloween changed everything. That night, my 3 closest friends, Jake, Emily, Tom, and I decided to explore an abandoned house on the outskirts of town. A place the locals said was haunted. On this special night, we just wanted a thrill. The house lay in the outskirts of Michigan, old and eerie, standing out like a scar amidst the overgrown fields and ancient trees. For ages, no one dared approach it after dark. Horror stories about the house spread like wildfire, ghostly figures, strange creatures appearing in the night. But after hearing these tales so many times, we got bored of them. And with a bit of liquid courage from the party we'd just left, we felt this was a fun challenge. When we arrived, the dim moonlight cast an eerie glow over the house. Half the roof was caved in, the windows shattered, and the peeling paint gave it a cold, desolate look. The place was steeped in a deathly silence, broken only by the rustling leaves and the soft wind swirling around us. Honestly, maybe we shouldn't go in, Emily whispered, her eyes darting around anxiously. Fine, but if you're scared, you can wait outside, Jake teased, trying to lighten the group's tension. We turned on our flashlights and headed inside. Every step made the old floorboards creak, as if the house itself resented our intrusion. Dust-covered furniture, thick spiderwebs, and peeling, stained walls created an atmosphere of dread. As we went deeper, room by room, a growing sense of unease settled over me. I didn't know why, but there was something about this house that made me feel more uneasy than any other abandoned place I'd ever been to. It felt as if an unseen force was observing our every move. I tried to push the thought away, convincing myself that it was just an old house and all my fears were in my head. Then, as we entered a dark room at the end of the hallway, an odd sound came from the other side of the house. It was a low, menacing growl, like that of a large animal lurking in the shadows. A chill ran down my spine, and my hands shook. This was no creaking of an old house. No wind, it was a real, terrifying growl. What was that? Tom asked, his voice trembling. No one answered. We all stood frozen, not daring to move, and the sound continued, growing louder, as if whatever was making it was coming closer. My heart pounded, and I knew I wasn't the only one feeling the sheer terror. We should leave, Emily said, her voice breaking. But before we could do anything, a pair of red eyes appeared in the darkness. They stared at us without hesitation or fear. I stood rooted to the spot, fear flooding through every part of me. The eyes were large, glowing bright in the darkness, and held a deadly intent. Jake whispered, his voice shaking, "That's Dogman. We need to get out of here. Now." We started running, none of us daring to look back. The growling continued behind us, as if the creature was pursuing us. I can't recall how I made it out of that house, I just remember running. Sprinting as if my life depended on it, fueled only by the hope of making it out alive. Finally, we burst through the front door and stumbled onto the damp ground outside. Gasping for air, hearts pounding in fear, no one said a word, we just looked at each other with sheer terror in our eyes. The house stood still in the dark, with no signs of anyone or anything inside. But I knew Dogman was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for anyone daring enough to enter its domain. From that night on, I never thought of the stories about Dogman as mere legend. I saw it, felt its presence, and I knew that creature was real, roaming within abandoned houses, hiding in the darkness, ready to unleash terror on anyone who dared to intrude. Story number 11. Dogman in Pennsylvania's National Park. I'd heard stories about Dogman many times before, mostly tales passed around in small towns across the Northeast, spoken of like folklore. But last Halloween, I had an encounter that I can't shake from my mind, and from that night on, Dogman became more than just a legend. It became a haunting memory. I'm an avid hiker, and Pennsylvania, with its hills, ancient forests, and majestic national parks, is one of my favorite places. On Halloween night last year, I decided to do a solo hike, something I'd done countless times to relax. There's something oddly peaceful about nighttime hikes, the stars stretching across the dark sky, the sounds of nature around me, owls hooting, wind rustling the leaves. By around 10 p.m., I had set up my tent at a small campsite deep within the park. Once it was up, I sat outside, sipping coffee and gazing at the stars twinkling against the dark backdrop. The night was unusually still, only the soft sounds of the wind and insects. Everything felt so peaceful, but I couldn't shake a nagging feeling that something was off. I chalked it up to being tired, so I decided to call it an early night. As I crawled into my sleeping bag, a strange sound broke the silence. It was a low, rumbling growl, like that of a massive creature lurking somewhere in the darkness. At first, I tried to convince myself it was a bear or a deer. But then the growl came again. Louder, longer, and far more menacing. My heart pounded. In that moment, I knew this was not the sound of any animal I'd ever heard. It was deep, rich, and full of something dark. As though the creature existed not just to hunt but to invoke fear. I shone my flashlight in the direction of the sound, scanning my surroundings, but aside from the weak beam, all I could see was dense, inky blackness. I stood still for what felt like an eternity. My heart hammering. The growling stopped, leaving a chilling silence hanging in the air. I tried to tell myself I was just overthinking it, that it was simply the wind or natural night sounds. But then, just as I turned back toward my tent, my eyes caught sight of a shape hiding among the trees. At first, it was just a massive, shadowy figure standing motionless, its eyes glowing like twin embers in the dark. My throat tightened. This creature was still, unblinking, and instantly, I knew it was not a bear or any other familiar animal. It looked like an enormous dog, but it stood upright like a human, and it was unnaturally tall. Its stance was menacing, with broad shoulders and a thick, dark coat, but what froze me in place was the fierce red glow in its eyes. They seemed to pierce through the darkness, locking onto me, and I found myself unable to look away. The creature took one step forward, and I could see its sharp, gleaming teeth in the weak light of my flashlight. It made no sound, just stared, but the silence was more terrifying than any growl. My entire body was frozen, as if some unseen force had pinned me in place, and I felt that even the slightest movement would prompt it to charge. After what felt like an eternity, the creature seemed to lose interest. It stepped back, disappearing into the shadows, swallowed by the dense forest. I stayed there, motionless, until all traces of it were gone. Just as I thought I was safe, another growl rang out, further away but just as threatening. It felt like a warning, a reminder that I had crossed into its territory, a place I wasn't welcome. I darted into my tent, locking it tightly, and sat there, trembling and trying to steady my breathing. I didn't sleep a wink that night, just sat in the tent, ears straining to catch any sounds outside. Every gust of wind and rustling leaf made me jump, fearing the creature would return. As soon as the first light of dawn appeared, I quickly packed up and left the park. On the way back, I couldn't stop thinking about those red eyes and the menacing presence of the creature. Knowing that the memory would be impossible to erase, I'd heard stories of Dogman before, but I never believed it was real. Now, I have no doubt, Dogman, or whatever it is, roams the dark forests of Pennsylvania, waiting for those who dare to wander into its territory. Story number 12, Dogman and the Mysterious Disappearance. I'll never forget last Halloween. No one in our town will. Because that was the night my best friend, Alex, vanished. I was one of the last people to see him, and what he told me that night still haunts me. Alex and I grew up in a small town where everyone knows each other, and nothing truly scary or strange ever happens. But last Halloween, Alex told me he urgently needed to see me once night fell. When I arrived at his house, Alex looked anxious, his eyes were wide, and he seemed exhausted and fearful, a stark contrast to the calm, cheerful person he normally was. Sitting across from each other in his living room, Alex told me a story that, he admitted, he still couldn't believe. He said that the previous night, while driving home from a friend's house way out in the countryside, he encountered something that left him terrified. It was a remote road, dark and foggy, where visibility was minimal. This narrow road cut through thick woods with no houses around. He explained that he'd been driving slowly, cautious of the winding curves, when suddenly, a dark figure appeared right in his headlights. Just a few feet away, Alex slammed on the brakes, and there, he saw what was blocking his way. It wasn't a person, nor any animal he'd ever seen. Under the weak glow of his headlights, he saw a creature standing upright, tall and covered in sleek, black fur. Its eyes glowed red like embers. Staring directly at him, he recounted in a hoarse, shaky voice that the creature's gaze wasn't the kind you'd expect from an animal. It was a cold, penetrating stare full of malice, as if it knew exactly who he was and could see right through him. The creature didn't move. It just stood there, staring, leaving Alex frozen in place, unsure of what to do. He said he felt paralyzed, unable to move. Then, suddenly, The creature let out a roar, a sound full of anger and menace that sent chills down his spine. That growl felt like a warning. And right after, the creature vanished into the darkness of the woods. Sitting across from me, Alex said he wasn't sure what he'd seen, but he was certain it wasn't any ordinary animal. "I think it was Dogman," he whispered, his voice laced with fear. Dogman. The creature we'd only heard about in eerie stories. A half-human, half-canine being rumored to roam the forests of the Northeast. We'd heard tales of Dogman before, but we never imagined anyone would actually come face to face with it. I tried to reassure Alex, suggesting he was probably just tired and that his imagination made things worse. But seeing the fear in his eyes, I knew he wasn't imagining it. Alex truly believed in what he saw, and that terror was etched deep in his mind. That night, I left Alex's house, worried about him. I couldn't shake off the eerie feeling, tossing and turning all night, haunted by the thought of what he'd seen. The next day, I tried calling Alex, but he didn't answer. I assumed he needed some time alone to rest and avoid discussing what happened. So I didn't press. But the following day, Alex's mom called me, her voice filled with panic. Alex was missing. No one knew where he'd gone. I rushed over to his house, and as I looked around his empty room, an unshakable dread gripped me. His phone, wallet, and everything he'd usually have with him were there, but he was nowhere to be found. Family and friends contacted the police, and over the next few days, we organized searches around town and the forest near where Alex had seen the strange creature. But every effort was futile. Alex had vanished without a trace. Soon, people around town started saying that maybe Alex had encountered Dogman, and that's why he disappeared. Rumors resurfaced, claiming Dogman chooses those who cross its path, that it only appears on Halloween to take anyone daring enough to confront it. I didn't want to believe those stories, but Alex's recounting of his experience haunted me, and I couldn't help but wonder if that creature really existed. It's been nearly a year now, and Alex still hasn't been found. Sometimes, I remember the look in his eyes that Halloween night, fear so deep and chilling. Unlike anything I'd ever seen in anyone before, Dogman might be just a myth, but the terror it leaves behind is real. And I know I'll never forget the night Alex told me about that creature. And if you ever hear a bone-chilling growl from deep in the woods, just remind yourself it's only a story. But stay far away. You never know who, or what, Dogman is waiting for in the dark. Story number 13. Dogman and the Nighttime Walker. Last Halloween was a cold and eerie night in rural Michigan. I remember it clearly. The quiet was so intense I could hear my own breath. No one would have imagined that what seemed like an innocent evening walk would turn into a memory that would haunt me forever. I've always liked taking walks on Halloween night. I'm not one for large gatherings. And in recent years, our town had quieted down a lot. Most of the older folks weren't interested in Halloween anymore, and the kids had grown used to celebrating indoors rather than going out for trick-or-treating. So, I'd often spend my time strolling along the small roads on the outskirts of town, soaking up the cool autumn air and the peace that I found calming. That night, I walked along a quiet road that bordered the woods. A thin layer of mist covered everything, glinting under the faint moonlight. The road was empty, not a single soul around, just the echo of my footsteps on the pavement. I pulled my coat closer and shoved my hands in my pockets, hoping for a bit of warmth in the bone-chilling cold. I don't know why, but from the moment I set out, I felt an odd sense of being watched. I'd walked this route many times, yet this time, something felt different. Everything was strangely still, no owl calls, no rustling leaves, just a heavy, unsettling silence that seemed to press in from all sides. As I approached a bend near the forest entrance, I came to an abrupt halt. There was something ahead, right in the middle of the road, that drew my attention. In the pale moonlight, I saw a dark figure standing motionless as if it had been there all along, silently waiting for me. At first, I thought it was a person, maybe someone else out for a walk like me. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness and the shape came into focus, I realized this was no human. The figure was tall and upright, but there was something unnatural about its form. It looked like a half-human, half-dog creature, but much larger than any dog I'd ever seen. Its hind legs were long and powerful, the upper body almost humanoid, but the head resembled a giant wolf or hunting dog. It was covered in dark fur that shimmered in the moonlight, and its eyes, Its eyes were a blazing red, glowing like embers in the darkness. Staring right at me, I froze, unable to look away from this creature. I didn't dare breathe deeply, feeling as though even the smallest movement might provoke it to attack. We stood there in a stare down for what felt like an eternity. Its cold, piercing gaze locking onto mine with an intensity that chilled me to the core. Then it let out a deep, guttural growl, a sound that I'll never forget. It wasn't the noise of any ordinary animal. It was the sound of something foreign and otherworldly. A low, resonant rumble filled with anger and malice. At that moment, I wanted to run, but my legs felt frozen, unable to move. Suddenly, the creature turned, gliding smoothly back into the woods. It didn't look back at me, but its dark silhouette left a lasting impression in my mind, as if it had left a mark of fear deep within me. Once I regained control of my limbs, I sprinted back toward town. My heart pounded, sweat trickling down my forehead despite the freezing cold. I felt as if something were following me, as though that creature was still lurking, its fiery eyes watching my every move, even though I knew it had already disappeared into the forest. When I got home, I slammed the door shut and collapsed onto a chair, trying to steady my breathing. I told myself it had to have been a nightmare, just a trick of my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling of how real it was. Couldn't forget those fiery red eyes and that menacing growl. I had encountered Dogman, the legendary creature I'd only ever heard of in stories. That Halloween night, it had shown itself, as if to warn me that the darkened paths of the night were not mine to tread. Story number 14. The Halloween hunting trip. We had no idea that Halloween night would become the most terrifying memory of our lives. My friends, Dave, Mark, Tom, and I were all seasoned hunters. Growing up in the countryside, hunting was just a part of life. Last Halloween, we decided to go on a night hunt in the forest near town. It was a cold, pitch-black night, with mist shrouding the trees, creating a hauntingly mysterious atmosphere. Stories of Dogman, the half-human, half-dog creature lurking in northern woods, have been passed down for ages. But honestly, I never believed any of it. We thought the biggest threats in the wild were deer or maybe a bear wandering in search of food. But that night, we encountered something beyond explanation. We set out after dark, carrying flashlights, hunting rifles, and a few supplies. The cold wind rustled the trees, filling the forest with strange, eerie sounds. After about 30 minutes of hiking, we stopped at a small clearing where we'd had good hunting luck before. But this time, it was oddly silent. There was no sound, no dry leaves falling, no insects chirping. It was as if the entire forest had gone still at our presence. Mark, with his keen eyesight, suddenly signaled us to stop. He was staring intently into the trees, his eyes tense with caution. "Do you see that?" Mark whispered, his voice so low it was barely audible. I looked in the direction he pointed, and at first, I didn't see anything. Then, Dave's flashlight happened to catch a strange shape among the bushes. At first, I thought it might be a deer or maybe a bear. But this creature, it was taller than any animal I'd ever seen. It stood on two legs, towering and powerful, with a muscular frame covered in black fur, and its red eyes glowed menacingly in the dark. We stood frozen, barely daring to breathe. Dogman, deep down, I knew we were face to face with that legendary creature, Dogman. The myth I had always thought was just a tall tale, now standing before us, staring back at us with those blazing red eyes. Dogman didn't move, just stood there as if it were sizing us up. Its eyes were sharp, filled with a terrifying, primitive hatred that no animal's gaze could ever hold. It wasn't just an animal's look, it was a cruel, powerful, and hostile stare that felt profoundly threatening. Mark raised his rifle, his finger trembling on the trigger. I wanted to shout, to tell him not to. But it was as if something were gripping my throat. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. We all stood there, paralyzed by fear, staring at that monstrous figure. Then Dogman let out a deep growl that echoed through the forest. A powerful, chilling sound that seemed to command us to leave. As soon as the growl ceased, Dogman turned and disappeared into the forest with terrifying speed. We stood there, trembling, unable to comprehend what had just happened. My heart pounded so loudly it hurt, and I knew the image of those red eyes would haunt me forever. Finally, Mark whispered, "We need to get out of here." No one objected. We quickly gathered our things and backed away, our eyes fixed on the spot where Dogman had vanished, afraid it might return at any moment. On the way back, not a single word was spoken. In the dead silence of the forest, the only sounds were our footsteps crunching through the leaves and our labored breaths. Once we exited the forest, we looked at each other in shock and horror. That entire night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of Dogman's red eyes came back to me, along with that bone-chilling growl. What I saw in the forest on Halloween night wasn't just a mysterious creature. It was a fragment of terror I never want to face again. Dogman isn't just a story, it's a presence. Something beyond the realm we understand. And I know that anyone who dares enter its domain will feel those red eyes watching them from the darkness. Story number 15. Dogman in the Abandoned Wine Cellar. Last Halloween, my close friends, Min, Tuan, Lin, Kwang, and I decided to do something a little different. Something that would be both thrilling and terrifying. Instead of dressing up and joining the usual noisy parties, we opted for a spooky adventure, exploring an abandoned wine cellar rumored to be haunted outside of town. This wine cellar lay deep in the rural outskirts, in a part of the countryside rarely visited. The entire town whispered that it had been abandoned after the owner mysteriously passed away. People claimed that it was a place no one dared enter, especially at night, but for us, the mystery made it all the more appealing. We had heard so many chilling stories yet had never tested them ourselves. Halloween was the perfect chance to challenge our courage. We set off at 11 p.m., when the streets were completely empty. Dim yellow streetlights cast a soft glow over the silent houses, and the occasional gust of cold wind added a chill to the air. Kwang brought a large flashlight, while Tuan carried a shovel, just in case, should anything unexpected arise. As we neared the cellar, the pale moonlight bathed the surroundings, making everything look frozen in the night. The cellar's entrance gate was rusted over, nearly swallowed by tall grass and cobwebs. Min gently pushed open the gate, and a creaky groan echoed through the still air, as if the cellar resented our arrival. Inside, the cellar was pitch black. Kwang turned on his flashlight, casting beams across the room's dark corners. We walked slowly past the moldy wooden racks and dusty old wine bottles. The musty scent filled the air, mingled with a cold that seeped right to our bones. A chilly breeze slipped through the gaps in the old walls, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Venturing deeper into the cellar, we entered a larger room, with a big wooden table and scattered chairs. The silence was unnerving, like time had stood still. But just as we prepared to move further, I heard a strange sound. It was a low, guttural growl coming from a dark corner of the room. I wasn't sure if I imagined it, but judging by my friends' faces, I knew they'd heard it too. Kwang's flashlight quickly focused on the source of the sound, and that's when we saw it. Amidst the shadows, a towering creature stood, watching us from afar, its glowing red eyes locked onto us in the dim light. Its figure was terrifying, a huge, muscular form covered in black fur, standing upright like a human but with the head of a wolf or dog. Its gaze was icy, sharp as a knife, as if those eyes could see right through us. None of us dared to move. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, a cold sweat dripping down my spine. The creature didn't make a move, just stood there as if waiting to see what we would do. The silence around us was suffocating, and each passing second felt like an eternity. Finally, Lin broke the silence, her voice trembling. "We need to go." But as soon as she spoke, the creature let out a low, menacing growl. No further encouragement was needed. We all turned and bolted out, none of us daring to look back. The sound of our footsteps echoed through the stillness, alongside the frantic beating of our hearts and our shallow, panicked breaths. We sprinted out of the cellar without a word, heading straight for the car parked outside the gate. Once inside, Kwang glanced back at the cellar, his face still pale with horror. I knew I'd never want to set foot there again, and I realized we had narrowly escaped something that didn't belong to our world. Since that Halloween night, we haven't mentioned Dogman or that abandoned wine cellar again. But deep down, I know that the image of those piercing red eyes and that knife-like stare will haunt me forever. Dogman isn't just a legend. It's a real entity, lurking in the darkness, waiting for anyone brave, or foolish, enough to trespass on its territory. You've just listened to 15 chilling encounters with Dogman, the mysterious creature that has haunted countless people. We hope these stories made your Halloween night unforgettable. If you enjoyed them, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss out on any of our upcoming horror videos. And if you have similar tales to share, leave a comment below. Your story might just make it into our next episode. Until then, see you soon, and sweet dreams, if you dare.